Hi everybody, Peter from the Soviet Influence here again for another episode of Take My Fire, where we're exploring some of the issues that are important to us as a band, because we are at our root a politically active musical group. Today I want to talk about a conversation I've been having recently with a local politician in the area where I live about the calls to defund policing, not only here in Ontario where I live, across Canada, across North America, and really, I'm sure, all over the world. You know, I come from a family that has policing in its roots. My grandfather was a police officer. I have an uncle who's a police officer. So I'm familiar with the attitudes that people have, the reverence that people hold police in. And this politician argued a lot of the common arguments that you hear, that crime rates are lower than ever, that people want police and jails the way that they are, and that when there are violent offenses taking place, when violent events happen, we need policing to protect us. And while in the face, all of those things do appear to be true, I challenge this politician to dig deeper and look underneath those ideas to see what's going on under there. I'll start with the easiest, violent events. Certainly there are some violent events that take place in our society. And as we know, recent news, some of them are caused by the police and the way that they intervene in situations. And we need to be aware of that. It's also true that there are occasionally major events. For example, there was a shooting in the Danforth in Toronto a couple of years ago that was very serious, and police intervened and stopped it. There was other events such as that have taken place. The reality is that the primary role of policing is not to intervene in those kinds of situations. Generally, their role is to investigate crimes that have already taken place, to find the people who've presumably done these crimes and to take them into the justice system. And in that sense, it's not clear what preventative role policing takes. I know there is some research that says, increases in policing do lead to lower crime. I've seen that, I've read that. It does seem to exist. Of course, there are other ways to lower crime that don't involve incarcerating people or seeking out and arresting people or creating a militarized police state. And I think it's important that we recognize that there's more than one approach to these kinds of issues. And along with that, the area where I live does have an incredibly low crime rate. And I would put crime in quotations because how we define crime is just as important as, how we prosecute crime, what we consider a crime. For example, the Toronto Star, a newspaper, did a report in 2016 about wage theft, employers not paying their employees what they deserve. And the numbers they were throwing out were 28 million, 30 million. And a lot of this money was never collected, never returned. I think it's up to 1/3. It was never ever recovered, even with, the intervention of the authorities responsible for that. I'll link to the article below this so you can read for yourself. And it shows we're very quick to arrest people for shoplifting or drug-related offenses, which are a whole other category that I think we need to talk about. And very slow to hold employers, corporations, small businesses to task for treating their employees in a way that's immoral and unethical and illegal. So how we define crime is so important. It's also important that we recognize the impacts of poverty, of lack of opportunity, of instability, of trauma in people's lives that lead to outcomes that we see. This isn't a new idea. People have been talking about the impacts of poverty, the morality of theft when it relates to poverty for a long, long time. So needless to say, to point at policing and saying policing is the solution seems very short-sighted, very myopic. There was an argument made that people want police, people want jails, people are happy with the system. And I don't argue that. I think people do feel that way. The majority of Canadians probably do feel that way. I also know that the majority of Canadians supported Japanese internment camps. The majority of Canadians supported turning away the MS St. Louis with its 900 Jewish refugees from Germany in World War II, or before World War II. The majority of Canadians supported the criminalization of homosexuality, and the majority of Canadians didn't think gay marriage should be legal at one time. So I find the argument that this is what the majority wants to be suspect on issues that are complex and require a depth of understanding. And I have an expectation that elected officials, people we give responsibility for our community to have a much more nuanced view of major issues than, well, this is what everybody wants. That's disappointing. So I challenge you to think about these issues, to think about the complexity of safety in a community, the definitions of crime. Just recently in Canada, cannabis use became legal with some pretty heavy restrictions. And the decriminalization and the legalization of substance use is such an important step towards building an actual safer society that actually supports its citizens rather than criminalizing people for seeking out ways to cope with the trauma that they experience in their lives. What we're asking for is balance and nuance. And what we're calling for is a meaningful defunding of policing services in Canada. We spoke in the previous video about the relationship between the government and Indigenous people. And I can't end this video without mentioning systemic racism in policing. The statistics bear it out time and time again. Indigenous people, Black individuals, people of color in Canada are unequitably targeted by police and criminalized. We see it again and again. The CBC just reported that despite a promise 2 years ago to clamp down on racism in the RCMP, there remains thousands of members in Facebook groups dedicated to policing that espouse the worst and most ignorant racist stereotypes about Indigenous peoples and other racial groups. Remains 2 years later. And in the immortal words of Rage Against the Machine, some of those that work forces are those that burn crosses. And that's just as true in Canada as it is in the United States. And all the pretty words of all the pretty politicians doesn't make change. We make change. I'll see you next time.